He hadn't spoken her name in a decade, but every dawn he poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the empty chair. Then one morning, a woman in a torn wedding dress collapsed on his porch, and with her came the past he thought was buried, riding hard and armed. Part 1. 2 Cups Under the Wind River Range. Winter came early to the Wind River Range, laying down its quiet like a wool blanket soaked in frost. The dawn light didn't spill. It crept, thin and cautious, across the sage flats that stretched westward from the cabin. The grass had turned brittle, rimmed with white, and even the wind moved slower, like it was thinking through old memories it hadn't visited in years. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, but not by much. The stove hadn't been lit long. Garrett Cole, 47 years old, and all of it earned, moved slow as he ground coffee in the hand mill. He didn't rush these mornings. There was a rhythm to them, a steadiness he trusted more than he trusted most men. His hands were square and strong, the backs of them scarred from barbed wire and branding irons, but they moved gentle around the handle. The steady rasp of steel on beams, the only sound in the quiet. When the grinding stopped, the silence filled in, heavier than before. He poured the coffee into the battered percolator and set it on the stove, listening as it hissed to life. His boots creaked when he turned, heavy on the floorboards, and he walked to the rough-hewn table by the window. 2 mugs sat on the table. He reached for the first, his, and poured. Steam curled in the pale light, carrying the rich scent of black roast into the air. Then he reached for the second, the chipped one. White enamel, the handle cracked where someone's thumb had pressed too hard a long time ago. He filled it anyway. The second mug was set in front of the chair, opposite his own. That chair hadn't been pulled out in a decade. Not since the last time someone else sat across from him at breakfast. He never spoke of it. No one asked. Folks in Red Butte knew enough to leave certain stories where they lay, especially when a man like Garrett Cole wore silence like armor. Outside, the eaves shuddered in a gust of wind. The tin roof rattled a warning and then fell quiet. A cow lowed in the distance, maybe Bess, the old brindle, and somewhere past the barn, the rustle of movement. The land was waking up, but the chair stayed empty, the mug stayed full, and Garrett sat, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around warm ceramic, staring past the glass at a world that hadn't asked him much and got even less in return. He wasn't a man given to talking. Most days the only sounds came from animals and wind, from creaking fence posts and weathered gates. He didn't sing, he didn't whistle, but he noticed things, the shape of a cloud, the way hoarfrost lined the bottom wire of a fence, the way snow clung to the lashes of a mule deer in the valley below. These things spoke to him in a language older than words. He sipped his coffee slowly without looking down. His eyes stayed on the flats. From the angle of the sun, it was still early. Shadows stretched long, painting the sagebrush in gray-blue lines. It was beautiful, but it wasn't beauty he was after. It was stillness. Out here, things didn't ask anything of you, not unless they were hungry or dying. When he finished his coffee, he didn't clear the mugs. He left the second one where it sat, same as always, still full, still untouched. He stood and walked to the stove, pulled on his coat, waxed canvas, worn at the seams, and took his hat from the peg. It had lost its shape years ago, molded now by weather and the kind of days that didn't end until your boots came off by firelight. There was work to be done. Always was. That's what kept things from falling apart. Work, routine, and the way a man kept his promises, even when no one remembered what they were. Garrett opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind hit him square in the chest, sharp with the promise of snow. He didn't flinch, just looked out across the land, eyes narrowed against the light. Somewhere in that wide, quiet world, something was moving. He didn't know it yet, but the trail had already begun. And by the time the next cup was poured, everything he'd held silent for 10 long years would start to stir. And this time, it wouldn't be just the wind rattling the eaves. Part 2. Signs in the Sky, Shadows in the Past. The sky had shifted by noon. Out beyond the fence line, the clouds dragged low and mean over the peaks of the Wind River Range. Slow-moving, iron-colored things that scraped the belly of the mountain and whispered warnings no man with sense would ignore. Garrett Cole stood near the east pasture gate, one glove off, testing the air with his palm like an old scout reading wind. The smell had changed. Wet dirt, lightning, cold iron, weather was coming. He whistled low, 3 short bursts, and the horses lifted their heads. Buck, the bay gelding, started toward him, hooves dull against the frozen earth. Garrett looped the lead rope and opened the gate. He didn't rush them. Animals felt panic quicker than people did, and today he wasn't about to stir anything more than necessary. By the time he got them inside the barn, the wind had picked up. It pressed against the siding like it wanted in, whistled through the cracks in the boards, and carried a smell he hadn't known in years. Dry smoke and horses not his own. He paused, listening. Nothing. But his hand went to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. He took the long way back to the house, walking the fence line with his collar turned up, one eye on the trail that curved east through the flats. It was a wagon path, mostly abandoned now. The rails had taken most of the travelers south, and what remained of the old trail saw little but wind, dust, and coyote tracks. Still, Garrett kept looking. A man who's seen enough doesn't need reasons, just instincts. He'd ridden that trail once himself, years ago, in the kind of dark that turns good horses skittish and men's hands hard on their belts. That was before Red Butte turned sour for him, before the badge came off. Garrett hadn't always been a rancher. He'd worn a deputy's star once, back when his shoulders were broader and his hope hadn't been tempered by loss. Back when Clara Dorsey was still alive. Her name came to him like it always did in cold weather, unbidden, unwelcome, sharp as a burr in the heel of a boot. He hadn't thought about her in weeks, but the way the clouds moved today, it all came crawling back. She'd been 17, or maybe 18, a housemaid, new to town, the kind that smiled too easily, not because she was loose, but because nobody had taught her what a man's hunger looked like yet. Silas Markham had. Garrett had found her once, bruised and trembling behind the mercantile. He offered help. She took none. Days later, her body turned up, caught in the river current. Dress snagged on driftwood, hair fanned out like black kelp underwater. The sheriff called it an accident. Garrett didn't. But the proof went missing, and the sheriff got himself a new saddle and a second ranch wagon. Not long after, Garrett left the badge on the desk and walked out without a word. Since then, he'd kept to himself. Fences, horses, sunrises, silence. And still, on days like today, with the wind mean and the trail empty, her name clung to the edge of his thoughts, like a splinter too deep to dig out. He reached the porch just as the first drops hit the brim of his hat. Not snow like he expected. Rain. Heavy, unseasonal smelling of trouble. The kind that turned trails to rivers and carried more than water with it. Garrett paused, one boot on the step. He looked out at the flats again. Toward the trail, nothing moved, but his gut said otherwise. The kind of storm riding in wasn't all weather. Part 3. The bride at the door. It was just past dusk when the knock came. Not a polite rap, not a hesitant tap, but a dull thud, heavy and off-center, like someone had stumbled against the door instead of trying to open it. Garrett Cole didn't move at first. He sat in his worn chair by the fire, his coffee cooling in the mug, eyes still fixed on the window. The wind had picked up again, curling around the corners of the cabin like a searching animal. He'd been listening to it for hours, but this sound wasn't the wind. It came again, not a knock, a collapse. Garrett stood, slow and silent, the way men who've lived alone too long tend to move. He picked up the Winchester, checked the load out of habit, and stepped to the door. The storm had swallowed the light. Only the flicker from inside reached the threshold when he pulled it open, and even that seemed to stop short when it hit her. She was there, standing, if you could call it that. A woman, barely, maybe mid-20s, soaked through. Her dress was once white, the kind meant for weddings, but now it was streaked with red mud and clung to her legs in heavy folds. The lace at the sleeves had torn, and the bodice sagged like it had been pulled too hard in too many places. Her hair was matted, plastered to her cheeks. One bare foot poked from under the hem, swollen, red, scraped raw at the arch. She didn't speak. Her eyes met his, wide, startled, and then the strength gave out of her knees. She folded forward with a wet, boneless kind of grace, like a sapling cracked by storm weight. Garrett caught her under the arms before she hit the floor. He stood there on the porch, holding a stranger in a ruined wedding dress, while the rain came down in sheets all around them. His breath fogged in the cold. Hers barely stirred. She weighed nothing. Damp fabric, hollow bones. Garrett didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why. He didn't speak at all, just turned, lifted her over the threshold like she was made of glass and carried her inside. The rain chased after them through the door, a gust of wind spitting water across the wood floor. He kicked the door shut and moved straight to the hearth. There was a buffalo robe in the corner. He laid it near the fire, set her down as gently as he could, and took 2 steps back, the old instinct of a man who knew when not to crowd someone broken. She curled on her side without a sound. Steam rose off her skin. Her fingers clutched the edge of the robe, knuckles pale. There were scratches on her arms, a bruise at her jaw. The fire cracked once, loud in the silence. Garrett poured a second mug of coffee and set it on the floor near her. It was the same one that sat across from him every morning. The cup no one had touched in a decade. He didn't think about that part, just did it. She didn't stir. So he sat down in the chair by the fire and watched the rain track its claws down the window. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, why she was alone in a wedding dress on a stormy ridge 30 miles from the nearest town. But something told him he wouldn't like the answer, and still, he hadn't left her out there. That part said enough. Part 4, Bruises and Buried Memory. The storm didn't let up. It hammered the roof in long, angry pulses, like a thing offended that it hadn't been allowed to take her. Garrett Cole sat still, his long frame curled slightly forward, in the old rocker by the stove. The woman lay wrapped in the buffalo robe just a few feet from him, the fire casting faint gold over the sharp lines of her face. She hadn't stirred, not once, but her body told its own stories. Garrett had seen things in his time, enough to know where the worst kinds of damage liked to hide. And he saw it now, even in the dim firelight. The wrist she clutched close had the faintest shadow around it. He leaned in slowly, careful not to startle her, and saw the truth plain. A dark bruise shaped like fingers, not just a fall, not just weather. A hand had done that. Her dress, now drying slowly on a chair back near the heat, bore other signs. Torn lace, a ripped seam at the shoulder, mud high up on one side like she'd been dragged, or like she'd run through something thick and didn't stop. He studied the side of her face again, bruised, pale, too still. Then it rose, quiet and sudden, like a ghost that had waited years for the door to open. Clara Dorsey. Garrett closed his eyes for a second. Let the name pass through him like wind across the rimrock. He hadn't thought of Clara in near 10 winters. He hadn't allowed himself to. But this stranger, this woman in the torn gown and wild eyes, she'd brought the name back without even speaking it, just by how she looked sleeping, or half-sleeping, just by the bruises. Clara had been 19. He'd been the law back then, badge shining like it meant something. And he'd promised her she'd be protected from Silas Markham, from his ranch hands, from the deals made behind closed doors between men with too much land and too few morals. But she'd ended up in the river anyway, face down, hands bound. He hadn't even been the one to find her, just the one who had to ride back to her father's place and say the words no one ever wants to speak. And when he tried to press charges, when he'd brought what little proof he'd gathered to the sheriff, that's when he learned how deep Silas's reach ran. 2 days later, Garrett's badge was in the dust and the sheriff had a new horse, new rifle, and 2 new deeds on land up by Bitter Creek. Garrett hadn't picked up a badge since, hadn't saved another soul either, until maybe tonight. He exhaled and sat back, watching the flames flicker. They danced orange over her cheek now. Her chest rose and fell, slow but steady. He didn't know her name, but he knew what had almost happened to her, and he knew what he'd failed to stop before. He pulled a wool blanket from the footlocker, shook it out, and laid it gently over her. The motion stirred a faint murmur from her lips. Not a word, just sound. It made him freeze, one knee still on the floor. She didn't wake, but her hand moved slightly, like it was trying to find something. Garrett didn't touch her, didn't speak. He just moved back, slow as winter shadows, and returned to the chair by the stove. The fire hissed as a drop of rain leaked down the flue. Outside, the storm rattled the windows. Inside, the old rancher stared at a woman wrapped in memory and bruises. And in the space between them, thick, quiet, unspoken, something began to shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe something close. Part 5. Eyes opening in the firelight. The wind had eased, just enough that you could hear the creak of the cabin settling. Old timbers talking to themselves after holding through the worst of the night. The rain was softer now, more like a whisper against the window panes than a fight. And inside, the heat from the fire had finally taken hold. Garrett Cole poured water into the coffee pot again. He moved like a man who'd done the same thing every morning and every storm for a decade, with the rhythm of habit, not company. But this time, there was someone else breathing in the room. He didn't look at her, not yet. The fire puffed once, and the woman on the floor stirred, slowly, like someone testing the air before fully waking. Her body curled slightly, like it had been cold a long time and wasn't sure it was safe to uncurl. The buffalo robe had slipped from her shoulder, revealing the pale, bruised skin of her collarbone, and her fingers tugged it back up without opening her eyes. Then she did. Her eyes opened sharp and wide, already looking for escape. Garrett watched from his seat by the window, saying nothing. She turned her head toward the door, then toward the windows, the corners of the room. Her gaze landed on her dress, hanging dry now near the stove, lace-wrinkled shoulder seams still torn, steam still curling up from it. Her breathing picked up. The blanket she clutched rode higher toward her chin, and she edged backward on the wood floor, inch by inch, as if trying not to draw attention. Her back pressed against the log wall, eyes locked on the only other person in the cabin. Garrett raised his hands slowly, palms open, no sudden movement, no sharp sound. "I won't come closer," he said quietly, "and I won't ask questions you ain't ready to answer." His voice was like the fire, low, steady, warm enough to stand near but not enough to burn. She didn't reply, but her jaw clenched, her shoulders too. "You collapsed on my porch," he continued, "in a wedding dress with blood on the hem and rain in your boots. Could have left you there. Didn't." Still nothing, only the tension of someone who'd lived too long expecting fists to follow words. He nodded once and leaned forward in his chair, just enough to reach the other coffee cup. The second one, the one that always sat cold. He filled it, careful not to spill. The scent of the brew filled the air again. He set the cup on him, the small table near the hearth, well out of her reach. Then he stood, walked across the room, and sat back down by the window. No motion toward her, no words, just space, the kind a wounded animal might need before it stopped biting. Minutes passed. The woman glanced at the cup, then back to him, then to the fire. "You're safe here," he said, so quiet the wind might have carried it off if she hadn't been listening close. She blinked once, then again, and finally her lips parted, not to speak exactly, but to shape a word like she hadn't used it in a long while. "Safe?" It sounded like something foreign on her tongue, like she didn't quite believe the taste of it. Garrett nodded once. "That's what I said." Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't full of panic, just uncertainty. Heavy, raw. She didn't reach for the cup. Not yet, but she didn't edge farther away either. The wind howled once outside, sharp and low, like it remembered something neither of them wanted to talk about. Inside, the fire kept burning. Garrett sat still, and across from him, the stranger in the torn white dress stared at the cup of coffee like it was the first honest thing she'd seen in a long, long time. Part 6. The reason she couldn't leave. The wind returned just before dawn, one of those stiff, wild sweeps that made the logs creak in their joints and lifted the smell of wet sage from the flats outside. A wind that didn't ask permission. Inside the cabin, the fire was steady now. The worst of the cold had passed. Lillian Harper had moved from the floor to the old rocker near the hearth. She didn't ask, just pulled the blanket tighter and took the chair like someone who knew how not to wait for an invitation. Garrett didn't stop her. He'd set fresh coffee between them. She hadn't touched it, but her eyes drifted toward it now and then, like it might vanish if she stared too long. Her wedding dress, dry now but wrinkled and warped from the storm, lay folded near the door, the hem still stained. He waited until the fire popped again before speaking. "I'd ask where you're headed," he said, "but you don't look like a woman with a destination." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the smoke curl up the flue, her fingers pressed flat on her knees. Pale fingers, clean now, but the bruises hadn't gone anywhere. "My brother owed him," she said at last. Not loud, not broken, just there. Garrett didn't move. Owed more than he could ever pay. Cards, whiskey, a pair of horses gone missing, and a fight that ended bloody in a mining camp. Garrett didn't press. He came to collect last spring, said the Harper name had cost him near $500 worth of trouble. Said he'd take it back in land or blood, and since Eli had neither, he looked at me. Her mouth curled slightly, not in a smile, but something bitter and tired. I didn't agree. I just didn't say no fast enough. Garrett shifted in his chair. Not to speak, just to remind her she wasn't alone in the room. She looked at the cabin walls like they might start closing in. I ran the first chance I had, yesterday morning. Still had the veil on when I jumped the fence. Garrett's jaw tightened. His hands folded in his lap, didn't twitch, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker like an old fuse burning low again. I figured I could make it to the post road, maybe flag down a stage or tuck into a wagon train headed west. She glanced toward the window now, but it was still dark beyond the glass. But this country's wide, and Silas Markham's reach is wider. That name. Garrett didn't flinch, but his gaze sharpened. Lillian saw it, and for the first time her voice faltered, not in weakness, but as if she'd stepped onto ice she hadn't expected. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. Garrett nodded once. The silence stretched between them. He didn't offer sympathy, didn't tell her he'd protect her or that men like Silas always got what was coming. What he did offer was practical. "There's a root cellar out back, stays dry, hidden from the trail." She looked at him then. "Director." "No." A single word, hard as a hammer on stone. He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not hiding, not again, not until he catches me barefoot in a church again." Garrett studied her a long while. "You think he'll ride this far?" "I know he will." She said it with the calm of someone who'd watched every door lock behind her and had learned not to scream through the bars. Her fingers curled tighter in the blanket. Outside, the wind shifted again. But it wasn't the wind this time. A low rhythm beneath it, barely audible. A beat, thump, 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 thump. Garrett rose slowly, stepping toward the door. He opened it just wide enough to see the yard, hand resting near the shotgun propped behind the stove. Through the haze of half-light and the grit of rain, shapes moved, not the random thump of branches or wind-blown clutter. Hoofbeats, separate from the storm, steady, purposeful. He turned back to her. "Get away from the windows." She stood. She didn't scream, didn't run, just clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching as Garrett Cole pulled the Winchester from its place by the window, the barrel glinting dully in the light of the fire. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Both of them knew the storm hadn't passed. It had just changed its shape. And this time, it was coming on horseback. So Part 7, First Meeting. Rain had turned from a whisper to a steady hiss, pattering on the sod roof and streaming off the sloped edges of the porch. The storm hadn't moved on. It had just decided to sit a while. Garrett Cole stood with his shoulder angled to the window, the Winchester balanced loosely in both hands, but not resting. His breath was even, but his eyes held a flint spark of memory he hadn't touched in years. Lillian stood just off to the side, half shielded by the inner wall of the cabin. She'd dropped the blanket, her hands, empty now, curled slightly at her sides. Her eyes were not wide with panic, just steady, watching, as if the cold had retreated into her bones and settled. They both heard it at once. Hoofbeats slowed, leather groaned, bits jangled, then silence. No call, no warning, just that quiet, wet stillness that only happens when something mean and confident steps into your world like it already owns it. Garrett cracked the door open an inch and peered through. 5 riders, one man in the center, larger than the rest, rain slicking down his shoulders like oil over stone. Broad-brimmed hat, dark duster, boots black and polished despite the mud. He didn't dismount. He didn't shout. He just looked at the house like he was measuring it for firewood. The men beside him were less polished. One had a scar that split his lip and curled it into a permanent snarl. Another's eyes twitched constantly. The horses they rode weren't trail-worn. These were animals bred to chase, and the men on them looked like they preferred it that way. Garrett stepped back from the door, then opened it in one smooth motion and walked out onto the porch, not bothering with a coat. The rain soaked through his shirt in seconds, but he didn't blink. He didn't speak, just stood, Winchester in his arms like a part of him, not a threat so much as a presence. The central rider urged his horse forward a single step. "Morning," the man said. His voice was deep, slow, the kind that could twist pleasant without meaning a word of it. Garrett didn't answer. The man let the pause linger, then smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, just an arrangement of lips and teeth. "I was told this was Cole's place." "You were told right. You Garrett Cole." "I am." That smile again, slower this time, eyes not leaving Garrett's face. "Name's Silas Markham." He said it like he expected the wind to carry it. Garrett didn't react, but Lillian, inside, heard it, and the small sound she made, almost nothing, caught in her throat like a splinter. "Was hoping you'd be hospitable," Silas went on. "Had a girl come through these parts. Bride, white dress, might have looked a little wet last night." Garrett said nothing. The scarred man dismounted. His boots sank into the mud with a heavy squelch, and he walked toward the porch like a man used to not being told no. Garrett moved half a step to his left. The Winchester came, up slow, not raised, not pointed, just present. Scarface froze at the base of the steps. Silas laughed, not loud, but enough to cut the tension in a way that made it worse. "You don't mind us taking a look around, do you?" Garrett's voice came calm, level. "I do." Silas studied him. That rain kept falling between them, as if it didn't care who drew first. "Now, Garrett," Silas said, voice syrup thick, "I got a lot of respect for a man who minds his own, but I got obligations, and one of those is bringing a woman back where she belongs." Garrett didn't blink. "She belong to you?" he asked. Silas's smile thinned. "She does now." "That how she sees it?" Silas's eyes cooled. "I didn't ride all the way here for a debate." "No," Garrett said, voice still even. "You rode here for an answer. You've got it." A pause. A long one. Rain hissed off leather. Hooves shifted. The man at the porch glanced back at Silas. Silas looked toward the hills. No movement, just mist. Then he leaned slightly in his saddle. "Well," he said, "if this turns ugly, it won't be today." He pulled his reins and nodded once to his men, but as they turned, Silas glanced over his shoulder. "I'll be back, Cole. And I take what's mine." Garrett held his eyes for a long beat. Then the riders faded into the fog, hoofbeats swallowed by rain. Garrett didn't move for a while. Neither did Lillian. Inside the cabin, her hands had curled into fists. Outside, Garrett still stood with the rifle loose in his grip, staring into the mist that hadn't yet decided to lift. The game had started, and this time, Garrett Cole wasn't walking away from the table. Part 8. Withdrawal with a threat. The last echoes of hooves faded into the fog, but the quiet they left behind wasn't peace. It was waiting, the kind of silence that holds its breath and listens for the sound of something doubling back. Garrett didn't move from the porch for a long while. Rain still tapped the boards like fingers drumming on a coffin lid. The Winchester stayed resting in his arms, barrel tipped low, but his mind was turning like a grindstone, slow, heavy, edged with old memory and present danger. Inside, Lillian stood just behind the curtain. Her eyes hadn't left him since the last rider vanished into mist. She hadn't spoken, hadn't even exhaled loud, but something in her face had shifted. Not relief, not yet, but no longer just fear, either. He came in slow, shutting the door behind him without a word. The cabin felt smaller than it had before, tight with questions, heavy with decisions neither of them had wanted to make just yet. She was the first to speak. "You know who he is?" It wasn't a question. Not anymore. Garrett set the rifle down near the hearth and pulled his coat from the peg. Rain dripped from the hem. "I know." "He won't stop." "No." The wind banged the loose shutter against the wall. Hiloa crossed the room to hook it down, then turned back. "He owns the banks in Bitter Creek, 3 of the water rights east of here, has a hand in half the law west of the divide." She wrapped her arms around herself, more from thought than cold. "Then why didn't he just take me?" Garrett looked at her, not just at her face, but deeper into the kind of question that came from someone who'd seen too many doors shut. He wanted to, he said. He came here expecting to, and you stopped him. No, he answered. The rifle did. A pause. Then she asked what he hadn't wanted her to. Why? He didn't answer right away. Went to the stove, checked the fire out of habit, threw in 2 sticks even though it didn't need them. He's taken before, Garrett said quietly. Lillian tilted her head. You mean Clara? His hand stilled on the stove door. So she'd heard. People talk in Bitter Creek, she said. When they think you're bought, they talk near you, loud. He shut the stove gently. He'll be back, Garrett said. Next time won't be polite. What'll you do then? Before he could answer, the sound of fast hooves cut through the storm. Not from the east, where Silas had gone, from the north trail, fast and light, a single rider pushing hard. Garrett was at the window in 2 strides, eyes narrowing. The figure cut through the fog like a shadow on a wire, rain fanning from the horse's flanks as it bounded the rise and hit the flat fast. Then a familiar shape resolved, coat soaked to the bone, hat down low but unmistakable. Amos Wright, the deputy. Garrett opened the door just as Amos pulled up, his horse snorting steam in the cold. Amos swung down and tied the reins, then looked up at Garrett through the downpour. We need to talk, he said, voice tight with urgency. Now. Garrett stepped back, motioning him inside. Lillian moved to the corner, cautious. Amos caught sight of her and gave a nod. Nothing said, but it was a gesture of recognition, not judgment. He stood near the fire, dripping, then looked at Garrett. Silas ain't gonna wait long. I know. There's more, Amos said. I came straight from the mine. Word came from Cheyenne, Marshal Preston Hale's riding down. He's got a file on Silas thick as a saddle blanket. Garrett said nothing. Amos continued. Trafficking, bribery, maybe worse, but he needs a witness. Lillian's brow furrowed. Amos turned toward her. Miss Harper, your brother Eli is being held in Silas's storage barn, locked up. Silas is using him to keep you quiet. She flinched. He's alive, Amos said gently, but not for long if you don't move fast. Silence. Then Lillian stepped forward, voice steadier than before. And what about Clara Dorsey? Amos looked at Garrett, then nodded. I always knew, Amos said. I just didn't have proof. Until now. Garrett's jaw tightened. Amos stepped closer. You have a decision to make, Garrett. You can stay behind your fence and hope Silas forgets, or you can help bring him down. And what's your play in this? Amos's voice was dry. I'm tired of seeing decent folks buried because a rich man wanted something. Another beat of quiet. Lillian's voice came soft. Then let's bury him instead. Amos looked between them. Garrett's eyes held his a moment longer, then shifted toward the door, where the fog still swirled and the wind hadn't eased. A storm had passed, but war was riding in. Part 9, Clara Dorsey's story. The fire crackled low, throwing long, pulsing shadows across the walls. Outside, the rain had eased into a steady whisper, like breath pressed against the window panes. Garrett poured coffee into tin mugs and handed one to Amos. The second, his old ritual, he set down before the empty chair. This time, it wasn't empty. Lillian sat there, her hands wrapped around the warm tin as if holding something fragile. Her hair still held rain, and the sleeves of her dress were stiff from drying. But there was more steadiness to her now, like a fence post that had stopped shaking in the wind and remembered its roots. Garrett sat opposite her, elbows on his knees, the mug untouched between his hands. She was 19, he said, not looking up. Same age as my sister was when she died. Lillian didn't speak. didn't move, only listened. Clara Dorsey, he said, bright, talked too fast. Read every book in the schoolhouse twice over. Her folks died of fever down in Cheyenne, and Bitter Creek took her in like strays get taken in. Kindness first, then caution, then silence. He finally looked at Lillian. Silas found her before anyone else did. The fire snapped. He offered her work, said he'd help get her on her feet, said she'd live in the main house, but that wasn't what he wanted. Garrett stood slowly and crossed to the small shelf above the hearth. There, nestled between a half-burned candle and a broken spur, was a small carved horse, a rough unfinished, barely more than a child's toy. He held it in his hand a moment before setting it gently on the table between them. She carved that, out of pine, he said. Gave it to me the day I got the badge. Back in Red Butte? Amos asked. Garrett nodded. I wore it 2 years. Thought I could change things. Thought if I did right by the law would do right by folks like Clara. He sat again, slower this time. Then she turned up in the river, cold, wrapped in cotton like a bride. Lillian's breath caught. Garrett's voice grew quiet. I knew what happened. Found the scarf she always wore, blood on it, caught on a rail behind the old mining shack. I took it to the sheriff. Took it to the banker. Took it to the church. He stared into the fire. No one wanted to see it. The room held still. They said she slipped. Said maybe she drank too much. Maybe she'd wandered. Maybe she wasn't right in the head. And Silas, Lillian whispered. Garrett's knuckles went white around the mug. Bought the silence. Same week the sheriff got a new horse and the church got a new bell. He looked at Amos. And I quit. Left Red Butte. Took what little land I had and got out from under it all. And lived alone, Lillian said softly, for 10 years. He didn't answer, didn't need to. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the eaves like old bones. A gust blew through the chimney and stirred the flames, throwing light over the small pine horse between them. Lillian leaned forward and traced her finger over its rough mane. I used to carve, she said. Nothing like this. Just whittling little things to keep my hands from shaking. Garrett met her gaze, and for the first time, there wasn't guarded distance between them. Only a long, thin bridge of shared silence, the kind that only people with buried dead could build without words. She didn't die for nothing, Lillian said at last. Amos nodded. Not if we finish what he started. Garrett's eyes didn't waver. You think Hale will get here in time? I know him, Amos said. He rides like he's got the devil behind him. He'll be here. Lillian stood and crossed to the window. Her fingertips brushed the glass. Outside, the rain had slowed to mist. The moon was somewhere up there behind the clouds, but it gave enough glow to see the outline of the corral and the shadows of the barn. She said quietly, Silas will come before the marshal does. Garrett rose, crossed the room, and set a hand gently on the edge of the window frame beside hers. Not touching, not crowding, but there, solid and steady. I know, he said, and this time, when she looked at him, there wasn't just fear in her eyes, there was fire. Part 10. An Unexpected Ally. The morning had not yet begun, but the air felt thick with what it would bring. The fire had burned low, coals humming with a deep glow like the last breath of something too stubborn to die. Garrett sat at the table, boots planted solid on the floor, one hand wrapped around the mug he hadn't drunk from. Lillian was by the stove, turning over the last embers. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows now. Her movements had steadied. That bone-deep tremble she carried the first night was still there, but buried, tucked under a kind of resolve that didn't need announcement. The knock came soft. 3 taps, then 2 more. Garrett was already on his feet before the last knock hit. He opened the door to find Amos Wright, soaked through and tight-jawed, standing with his hat in his hand, and something coiled behind his eyes like a truth too big to carry alone. Garrett stepped aside. "Get in." Amos crossed the threshold with the weight of someone who hadn't rested in days. He smelled of saddle leather and cold iron and Wyoming rain. Lillian had already poured him a cup by the time he sat down. "Ride through the night?" Garrett asked. Amos nodded, his voice raspy. "Didn't stop." He took a long drink, then leaned back. "We got trouble coming, and help if we move quick." Garrett waited. "Eli Harper's still alive," Amos said, looking at Lillian. "Silas has him locked in the storage barn out past Silver Gulch. Says he's keeping him safe. Truth is, he's keeping him quiet." Lillian said nothing, but her hand clenched around her apron. Her jaw went hard. She did not cry. Amos continued. "Sheriff's no use, but I wired Cheyenne before I rode out. Preston Hale's on his way." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Marshal Preston Hale?" Amos nodded. 3 days out, riding with a federal file thick enough to bury Silas twice. "That man doesn't ride unless the ground's shaking," Garrett muttered. "He's riding now," Amos said, "and he ain't riding light." Garrett looked out the window toward the flats. The wind had settled. The storm had passed, but not the danger. The danger was gathering behind it, clearer now, visible in the way the prairie held its breath. "Silas'll come before him," Garrett said quietly. Amos nodded. "That's why I came here first." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we don't wait." There was a long pause. Garrett stepped over to the old cupboard and pulled out a box wrapped in oilskin. He opened it slow, like a man unwrapping something sacred. Inside, a badge, dulled by time, a map with faded ink, and a holstered revolver, well-oiled despite the years. He set the badge down on the table. It clinked against the tin of Amos's cup. "Last time I wore that, it got someone killed." Amos looked up. "And the time before that, it saved 3. Garrett said nothing. Lillian stepped forward then, quiet but unshaken. "If you don't stand," she said, "he'll come again. For someone else. Another Clara. Another me." Garrett studied her. Her eyes didn't flinch. "I ran once," she said. "It cost me more than I had." She looked down at the table where Garrett's mug sat untouched, beside the pine horse. She reached out, gently pushed the mug closer to him. "And I'm tired of running." Garrett breathed in through his nose. Then slowly he reached for the revolver, checked the chambers, and slid it into the holster at his side. He folded the badge back in the cloth and tucked it into his coat. Not to wear yet, but not to bury either. "Then we'll wait," he said, "but we won't do it sleeping." Amos stood. "You've got till first light." Lillian crossed to the hearth and added another log. The flames caught, leapt, reached higher. Garrett stood in the firelight, casting a long shadow over the floorboards. He looked to Lillian, then to Amos, and then to the plains beyond. "If he wants to finish what he started," he said, voice quiet but hard as bone, "he can come to my door." Part 11. Morning fog. Dawn came slow and gray. Fog rolled in from the river basin, not thin like breath, but thick as wool, muffling hooves, cloaking distance, smothering sound. You couldn't see 20 feet out the window, but Garrett didn't need to. He felt it, like a tremble beneath the floorboards, like something ancient stirring in the marrow of the valley. He stood by the window with the rifle propped against the sill, his jaw dark with overnight stubble and his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms. Lillian was behind him, silent, her arms wrapped around a mug she hadn't drunk from. The fire still burned. The smell of coffee clung to the air, but it was a morning neither of them would remember for warmth. He counted the shadows first, vague shapes coalescing at the edges of the fog like ghosts testing the edge of the world. 1, 2, 5. More. Then he saw them. 12 riders forming a wide ring, rifles pointed inward. No banners, no lawmen, just hired guns and sharp silhouettes. Men paid to surround, not to talk. Garrett didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. A single rider broke from the ring, dismounting slow. Fog wrapped around his legs like a curse. Silas Markham walked forward with the patience of a man who believed time belonged to him. His coat was slick with mist, hat low, silver trim on his belt glinting in the flat light. He came to the edge of the porch and tipped his hat like they were neighbors discussing cattle prices. "Morning, Cole." Garrett's voice was quiet. "You brought a lot of mouths for one conversation." Silas grinned. "I like to be thorough." Behind Garrett, Lillian stood. She didn't step forward, but she didn't step back either. Her eyes were on Silas. Her fingers clutched the table's edge until the knuckles blanched. Silas turned his gaze toward the window, his eyes finding hers through the rippled glass. He smiled, slow and cruel. "I came for what's mine." Garrett's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "She's not yours, and she never was." Silas shrugged. "Her brother owes me." Oaths were made, witnessed. "And Eli?" Garrett asked. Silas raised a brow. "He's still breathing. You give me the girl, and I'll give you peace. Eli walks free. You go on pretending you're some kind of saint up here in the fog. Everyone wins." Garrett didn't answer right away. He just turned slightly, enough to see Lillian. Her lips parted like she was about to speak, but instead, she stepped away from the stove and crossed the room, her boots quiet on the plank floor. She reached the door and stood beside Garrett, not behind him, not shielded. Garrett opened the door. She stepped onto the porch. The fog clung to her white shirt and the ends of her unbraided hair. Her voice, when it came, was even, cutting through the still air like a bell rung in church. "You'll release my brother," she said, "and you'll leave this place." Silas didn't blink. "I gave you shelter, girl. I gave you a name. You gave me a sentence." Silas stepped forward. "You think this man can protect you?" "I don't need protection," she said. "I need you gone." She raised her voice then, just slightly. "I've seen what happens to girls who stay quiet. Like Clara Dorsey." Behind Silas, some of the men shifted in the fog. Silas's jaw tensed. "That name's buried." "No," Lillian said, steady. "It's just been whispered too long. I'm not whispering anymore." A moment passed. You could hear the damp creak of saddle leather, the breath of horses, the ghost of wind. Then from the far east side of the flats came the echo of hooves, not rushed, measured. Garrett's eyes narrowed. He knew the sound. Federal horses didn't gallop. They arrived. Silas heard it too. Out of the fog, a rider emerged. Then another. Then 5 more. Marshal Preston Hale rode up with the posture of a man who had long since stopped worrying about what was polite. He wore a dust-colored coat, 2 pistols at his sides, and a face carved in courthouse stone. He didn't slow as he approached Silas's circle, just rode right through it as if it weren't there. Garrett stepped down from the porch. Hale looked at him, nodded once. Then the marshal's voice carried, low but clear. "Silas Markham, you're under federal investigation for the trafficking of minors, conspiracy to defraud, and obstruction of justice." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, thick as a short story. "I have a warrant and a list of names. Yours sits at the top." The fog in that moment felt like it paused too, waiting to see which way the world would turn. Silas looked to his men. A few stared back at him blankly. A couple looked toward Hale. He stepped back, slow, measured. "Marshal," Silas said smoothly, I'm just here to retrieve what's mine. Hale didn't move. Step back, sir. Silas hesitated. His hand drifted just barely toward his belt. Garrett's fingers twitched near his Winchester. Then the fog shifted again, and everything held its breath. Part 12. Public Challenge. Lillian Harper stood just inside the cabin, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the worn pine table. She hadn't moved since Garrett counted the rifles through the morning fog, one then another, until a dozen shapes took root like weeds in a slow-growing circle around the homestead. She'd heard the offer from Silas. Trade herself for her brother and keep Garrett untouched. His voice had been calm, too calm, like someone offering terms for a horse, not a life. Garrett hadn't answered. He just looked at her. Not with pity, not with fear, just steady, like a man waiting for the weather to show what it meant. But now she stepped forward. The door creaked open as she pushed it. The fog still hung low and close, wrapping the porch in pale gauze. She stepped out into it like a figure in a dream, wedding boots still muddy from the storm that brought her here. Silas Markham turned his head. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked smug, like a man already measuring where she'd sleep in his house and what bridle she'd wear at Sunday socials. "I'll go," she said, voice even, clear. "But only if Eli walks free and Mr. Cole is left untouched." Silas chuckled, shaking his reins. "That's mighty reasonable of you, Mrs. Markham, to be. I'm not your wife." "Not yet." Silas tipped his hat like he'd already won. His men shifted in their saddles, boots creaking leather. Then she added louder now, "But before I go, there's a name I want to speak, so every man here hears it." The wind stirred. Silas's hand twitched at the reins. "Clara Dorsey," she said. "You remember her, don't you, Silas?" His jaw tightened. "I do. 19, drowned in winter with bruises on her throat. Your kind of justice." For a moment, no one moved. Even the horses quieted. "That's a lie," Silas said, too quick, but not quick enough. One of his men, a younger rider with a patchy beard, shifted uncomfortably. "I ran too," Lillian said. "Not from marriage, but from what you become after marriage." She took another step off the porch, boots crunching on frost-slicked boards. "You don't own women, Silas. You break them. That's why Clara died. That's why you want me." And then, hoofbeats from the east, steady. Sure, government horses. A dusting of snow kicked up behind them as Marshal Preston Hale rode in, 6 men flanking him, dusted in the law and cold travel. Hale was tall, with a beard like carved bark and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "Mr. Markham," Hale called, "got a stack of papers, says your name more than once." Silas didn't turn. His hand dropped toward his belt. Hale signaled his men, slow and wide. "Trafficking, murder, coercion, witness tampering. We've got affidavits from Red Butte and Cheyenne, and the statements of 2 women brave enough to speak what others only buried." The air tightened, like canvas drawn taut. Silas turned in the saddle, eyes sweeping the cabin, the marshals, then landing hard on Garrett, and then Garrett saw it. The twitch in Silas's right hand. The same twitch he saw 10 years ago, just before a girl drowned and a sheriff got rich. He reached toward his rifle just as... Part 13. Gunfight in the mud. The fog broke like a veil when the first shot cracked. It wasn't Silas who fired first. It was the instinct. A buckskin rifle swung from the high slope above the cabin, just past the edge of the tree line. The echo of it tore through the silence, and the man who fired didn't need to look twice. Amos Wright, deputy no longer, had taken his perch in the pre-dawn dark and waited like a man who owed something deeper than law. Silas's shoulder snapped back as the bullet struck high, spinning him half in the saddle. But wounded men are dangerous when they've lived too long believing nothing could touch them. His revolver cleared leather even as blood soaked his shirt, and the shot he loosed went wide, sparking off a fence post near Garrett's head. Then the whole field lit. The marshals drew and answered, not with panic, but practiced calm. Federal men knew how to hold a line. They spread out, moving low and forward, boots sinking into the sodden grass, their rifles barking like judgment called out loud. One of Silas's riders, a scar-faced man with a red bandana, jerked in the saddle as Hale's second shot caught him below the ribs. He pitched forward, horse shrieking and galloping riderless back toward Bitter Creek. Another turned his horse hard to flee, but ran straight into Amos's second round, clean through the thigh, not fatal, but enough to drop him hard. The man crawled toward his hat, then gave up, both hands raised. Lillian stood rooted on the porch, unmoving, not screaming, not crying, watching it all. Garrett moved like he had 10 years ago, only this time he wasn't wearing a badge, just carrying the weight of what he hadn't done then. Clara's name echoed in his ears as he stepped down the porch, shotgun steady in his hands. Silas tried to rise. Even with one arm limp and blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth, he pushed to his knees. He locked eyes with Garrett, the grin gone now, only something raw left, like the animal beneath the fine coat and silver belt buckle. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped, spitting into the mud. Garrett didn't answer. He just lowered the shotgun. Hale strode forward, cuffs in hand. But Silas wasn't finished. With one last jolt of fury, he lunged for the pistol dropped beside him in the grass. That's when Hale fired. Just once. The sound was flat, final. A crow flapped from the fence line. Silas fell back, eyes still open, but nothing left behind them but sky and regret. Rain came after. It wasn't loud at first, just a hiss, like the land itself exhaled. Then it fell harder, soaking the bodies, the blood, the broken fence rail. The prairie turned to rust-colored mire. Boots sucked deep, the smoke washing down into puddles where frogs had once lived. Amos walked down from the ridge, rifle cradled in his arm like an old truth come home. No one spoke. Not yet. Marshal Hale tipped his hat toward Lillian. "Ma'am," he said, "he won't touch no one again." Lillian didn't answer. She stepped down, the hem of her old wedding dress dragging in the wet. She stood beside Garrett, close but not quite touching. Garrett reached out slowly, not to hold her, just so she'd know she wasn't standing alone. Behind them the cabin waited, still warm, still quiet. Inside, the fire crackled low, and the second coffee cup still sat on the table, waiting. But not for a ghost this time. Part 14. 2 cups filled. The rain had passed by dawn. It left behind a heavy hush, the kind only known to places where blood once sank into the earth. The sky stretched wide and gray-blue over the Wind River Range, clouds pulling back like a man turning his collar to let the sun hit skin that hadn't felt warmth in years. Garrett Cole stood on the porch, a mug in each hand. The boards beneath his boots still held the scuff marks from the fight, mud, hoof dents, blood faint as rust where Silas Markham had tried to make the world belong to him. Lillian came up beside him. Her hair, damp from the earlier wash, hung loose over her shoulders. The bruises on her wrists had faded to yellow. The dress she wore now was simple calico, not new but hers. Not borrowed, not forced. Below them, Eli Harper sat on the edge of the corral, nursing a tin cup of his own. He moved like a man who'd been caged too long, testing his limbs against the open space. Amos Wright leaned against the fence post nearby, chewing on a blade of grass, hat pulled low. The old sheriff of Bitter Creek had been taken without protest. Turns out a man who sells justice never expects it to come back for him. Marshal Hale and his men had ridden out before first light, their warrant fulfilled, their horses leaving long, wet tracks through the flats. There were no parades, no handshakes, no crowds, just a silence that felt cleaner than noise. Inside, the fire still burned low. Garrett had risen early, like always, and ground the beans slow the way his hands remembered. He'd filled 2 mugs, not out of habit, out of choice. When he set them down, one was placed before her seat, not the one across the table, the one beside him. Lillian had seen that. Said nothing, just took it in like breath after drowning. They didn't speak of the past much after that. Some things had been said. Some things simply lived through, and that was enough. 6 months passed. Seasons turned like pages on an old ledger. The ranch held steady. Calves dropped. Fences were mended. Garrett built a new coop near the back shed. Lillian planted sprigs of wild mint near the kitchen stoop. When they rode into Red Butte that September, no one made a fuss. Clara Dorsey's name had already reached the town square and whispered down from the church bell. Folks knew, and the few that mattered nodded when Garrett and Lillian stood side by side before the circuit preacher, the Wyoming wind brushing soft across her veil. There were no rings, just 2 hands held tight and the look of people who'd already been through the worst and still stood facing east. Now, as morning broke again, Garrett poured coffee into both mugs. Steam lifted. Lillian stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. He passed her a cup without needing to ask. She took it, sat beside him. The chair across from them stayed empty, because neither of them needed it anymore. In the hush between them there was no need for talk, only the slow, grounding sound of 2 people sipping from full cups. A fire inside, warming more than hands. Outside, wind stirred the sage. Far off, a hawk circled, riding the currents alone. But here, on this porch, beneath the quiet sky, 2 folks who once carried every reason to leave had chosen at last to stay. Sometimes healing doesn't come loud. It rides in with the storm, sits quiet at the table, and stays through the morning. Garrett didn't save her, and Lillian didn't come looking for a savior, but somewhere between silence and coffee. 2 people who'd stopped hoping found enough warmth to stay. The West is full of wide places, broken trails, and folks carrying more scars than they show. But maybe, just maybe, kindness can still ride faster than fear. If this story stirred something in you, leave a word below. Not to explain, just to be part of the fire that never quite goes out.